Have you ever wondered how a beautiful young woman, destined for an ordinary life, became one of the most extraordinary saints following a simple accident on the ice? The story of Saint Lidwina of Schiedam challenges us to rethink the meaning of suffering in our lives. For 38 years, this Dutch young woman remained confined to her bed, enduring indescribable pains that transformed her body into a living image of the crucified Christ. However, what might have turned into an existence filled with bitterness and despair blossomed into a luminous testimony that suffering, when embraced with faith and offered with love, can become a source of grace for the entire Church. Chapter 1. The Early Years of Lidwina. How could a simple child born in the humble town of Schiedam in the Netherlands become one of the most extraordinary examples of Christian patience ever known by the Church? Lidwina was born in 1380, the daughter of simple yet deeply devoted parents who, from her early childhood, sowed within her the seeds of faith that would later flourish in an extraordinary way. From a very young age, Lidwina showed a natural inclination toward piety. While other children her age spent their days playing, she preferred to accompany her mother to Holy Mass, where she remained absorbed in the contemplation of the Blessed Sacrament. Her parents, Wilhelmus and Petronila, marveled at how their daughter, even as a small child, seemed to comprehend the mysteries of faith with an unusual depth for her age. At the age of 7, Lidwina was already practicing small mortifications, willingly depriving herself of sweets and other childhood pleasures to offer them to the child Jesus. This early manifestation of sacrifice foreshadowed the path of the cross she would later embrace with extraordinary fidelity. Her confessor noted in the confessional room the purity of this exceptional child's soul, whose transgressions were so few that he could hardly find material for absolution. The neighbors of Schiedam frequently commented on the physical beauty that Lidwina developed over the years, but they admired even more her modesty and reserve. Unlike many young women of her time, she never flaunted her appearance, considering inner beauty as the only truly valuable adornment. On one occasion, when someone praised her beautiful hair, she simply replied, "It is virtues that adorn the soul in the eyes of God, not the attributes that perish over time." When she turned 12, some young men from prominent families began showing interest in the virtuous maiden. Her parents, considering the advantages of a convenient marriage, spoke to her about the possibility of a future union. However, Lidwina, demonstrating a determination unusual for her age, confided her desire to be entirely consecrated to Christ as her only spouse. This longing for total surrender would be fulfilled, albeit in a way very different from what the young woman might have imagined in those moments of youthful fervor. Chapter 2. The Fall on the Ice. The wintry cold of 1395 covered the canals of Schiedam with a thick layer of ice. On the feast of the Presentation of the Virgin, while the faithful headed to the celebration of Holy Mass, Lidwina, then a beautiful 15-year-old, was walking alongside her friends on the ice covering one of the many canals in the city. What began as a moment of youthful joy would become the turning point that marked the rest of her life. One of her companions invited her to glide as the other young people did, an activity to which Lidwina reluctantly agreed. "Come on, it will only be a moment," insisted her friends, unaware of the consequences of that innocent pastime. As she glided, one companion lost her balance, and in trying to grab onto Lidwina, both fell. In the fall, Lidwina fractured a rib and suffered severe internal injuries that no physician of the time could accurately diagnose. Transported to her parents' home, a calvary began for her that would last for the next 38 years. In the first days, the family held out hope for a swift recovery, but it soon became clear that the injury was much deeper and more complex than it appeared. The initial injury was complicated by a series of ailments, including intense pain, progressive paralysis, and an extreme sensitivity that meant even the slightest contact caused excruciating suffering. The best doctors in the Netherlands were consulted, applying all sorts of remedies known at the time. Some of these treatments, far from alleviating her condition, only increased her suffering. A doctor from Rotterdam, after examining her, confided to her parents, "Only God can heal what medicine does not understand. The nature of her ailment escapes our comprehension." These words, though disheartening from a human perspective, proved prophetic regarding the supernatural destiny that awaited Lidwina. In the first months after the accident, the young woman struggled internally against despair. At the peak of her youth, she saw her future shattered and her hopes fading away. "Why me, Lord?" she would cry in tears during nights of insomnia and pain. It was then that her parish priest, Father Juan Pot, spoke to her about the redemptive mystery of Christian suffering, explaining how her pains, united with those of Christ, could become a source of graces for her and for many others. This perspective of faith gradually transformed her view of suffering, turning her bed of pain into an altar of continual offering. Chapter 3. The Years of Suffering. As the days passed, Lidwina's condition progressively worsened. What had begun as a simple fracture turned into a complex series of ailments affecting her entire body. Her skin became ulcerated, forming painful sores. Her limbs gradually became paralyzed one by one, and she suffered from dropsy, an accumulation of fluids that deformed her once beautiful face. The physical suffering was so intense that visitors could barely hold back their tears at the sight of her condition. During the first 3 years of her illness, Lidwina battled against the temptation of impatience and bitterness. "I can't take it anymore," she sometimes confessed to her confessor. "This chalice is too bitter for my lips." The priest listened with compassion, but firmly guided her to look upon the crucified Christ. "Look at the Lord on the cross," he would say. "He who was innocent suffered out of love for us. Your sufferings, united with his, have infinite value in the eyes of the Father." These words took root deeply in the young woman's heart. One night, while enduring terrible pain, she had a vision of Jesus crowned with thorns, who said to her, "If you follow the path of my cross, you will feel the sweetness of my presence." From that moment on, Lidwina began to understand that her illness was not a punishment, but a mysterious divine choice, a privileged participation in the passion of the Redeemer. This understanding changed her attitude. She no longer asked to be freed from her suffering, but for the strength to endure it with love. Her room became a school of holiness. Those who came to comfort her left consoled by her own example. As her body weakened, her spirit grew stronger, radiating a supernatural peace that contrasted with the obvious physical pain she endured. "My body is like a battlefield," she would explain to her visitors, "but inside there is a sanctuary where the peace of Christ reigns." This paradox of suffering transfigured by love became the most eloquent testimony to her sanctity. Over time, Lidwina developed an astounding control over her natural responses to pain. Where there had once been complaints, now prayers were heard. Where there had been tears of self-pity, now shone a smile that left visitors puzzled. On one occasion, while undergoing a particularly painful treatment, a physician asked her how she managed to remain so serene. She replied, "It is not I who endure, but Christ who endures in me. He transforms this bed of pain into a bed of roses when I offer every sharp pang for the salvation of souls." This constant attitude of offering characterized the long years of her illness. In the most acute moments of pain, she was heard murmuring, "My Jesus, even if it is your will, give me your grace." Her room became a sanctuary where many came not only to show compassion, but also to learn the true meaning of Christian patience and the redemptive value of suffering when offered with love. Thus, confined to her sickbed as Christ was to the cross, Lidwina silently became a teacher in spiritual life for her entire community. Chapter 4. Visions and Ecstasy. As she advanced on the path of the cross, God favored Lidwina with extraordinary mystical gifts. In the 7th year of her illness, she began to experience ecstasies during which she was lifted from her bodily senses and transported in spirit to celestial realities. These raptures typically occurred at night or in the early hours of dawn, when the physical pain reached its peak. In one of these ecstasies, she confided to her confessor that she was led by her guardian angel through purgatory, where she beheld the sufferings of the souls undergoing purification. "I saw familiar faces," she later recounted, "souls that no one even remembered in their prayers. They showed me how every small act of offering made on earth can greatly ease their torments." From then on, Lidwina especially dedicated her sleepless nights to the most forgotten souls in purgatory, establishing a deep spiritual communion with them. The heavenly visions gave her the strength to persevere in her earthly Calvary. On one occasion, during the octave of Pentecost, while the priest elevated the Blessed Sacrament in the Mass celebrated in her room, Lidwina was transported in spirit to celestial Jerusalem. "I saw a city of indescribable light," she recounted afterward, "where the saints sang praises before the throne of the Lamb. Each had a place according to the merits acquired on earth, yet all were united in one perfect heart of love." This vision gave her a new understanding of the value of every suffering offered in love. They became precious stones for her eternal dwelling. Not everyone believed in the authenticity of her experiences. Some physicians attributed them to feverish delirium. Certain theologians, fearing possible deceptions by the devil, subjected her to rigorous interrogations. Lidwina bore these trials with humility, never insisting on the veracity of her visions. "If they are from God," she would say simply, "He himself will defend them. If not, blessed be He for sparing me from deception." But this attitude of absolute detachment and submission to the Church's discernment was the best proof of the authenticity of her supernatural experiences. One of the most extraordinary phenomena she experienced was spiritual bilocation. People from distant places testified that they had received Lidwina's comfort in moments of tribulation, even as she remained physically unmoving in her sickbed. A priest from Utrecht, on the brink of abandoning his vocation, related how she appeared to him in spirit, urging him to persevere. "She spoke to me so clearly about the struggles of my soul that no one else could have known, and I had no further doubt about the divine intervention through her." These events, carefully documented by her confessor, later played a crucial role in the process of her canonization. The graces did not exempt her from physical suffering. In fact, they seemed to intensify it, following the paradoxical spiritual economy, where a greater intimacy with God entails a greater identification with the crucified Christ. Yet these supernatural experiences transformed the meaning of her pain, turning it into a mysterious space for encountering the divine. "Suffering is like a veil," she explained to a young visitor, "that when torn reveals the presence of God. The more it is torn, the more clearly the face of the beloved is seen." Chapter 5. The Eucharist as Sustenance. During the early years of her illness, Lidwina received Holy Communion as frequently as the customs of the time allowed, approximately once a month. However, as she advanced in her spiritual journey, an insatiable hunger for the Eucharistic bread grew within her. Father Juan Pot, understanding the depth of her devotion, obtained special permission from the bishop to administer communion more frequently, a rare privilege in those days. Each time the Blessed Sacrament was brought into her room, those present could observe an extraordinary phenomenon. Her face, deformed by illness, would transfigure, radiating a supernatural beauty reminiscent of her youthful years. "It is as if the true presence of Christ temporarily dissolves the marks of suffering," commented her mother to a neighbor on one occasion. This phenomenon became so well known that many neighbors requested to be present during these Eucharistic visits, hoping to strengthen their own faith in the face of such a manifestation of divine grace. From the 15th year of her illness onward, Lidwina entered a new phase in her spiritual journey. she began to subsist exclusively on the Eucharist. Every attempt to ingest solid food or liquids provoked violent vomiting, but upon receiving the Blessed Host, not only did she absorb it with ease, she also experienced a renewed vigor. The doctors, unable to scientifically explain how she could subsist without material nourishment, even mounted watches to verify that she was not secretly eating. After rigorous observations, they had to admit that they were in the presence of a supernatural phenomenon. This mystical fast was not unknown in the history of the Church, having been observed in saints like Catherine of Siena. For Lidwina, it represented the physical expression of the theological truth that Christ himself had taught. "My flesh is true food, and my blood true drink." Her emaciated body thus became a living testimony to the sustaining power of the Eucharist, both spiritually and physically. "I nourish myself from the same bread as the angels," she explained to those marveling at her condition. "How could I desire food that perishes?" The hours following the reception of the Eucharist were moments of intense contemplation and prayer for Lidwina. Her family knew not to disturb her during this sacred time of intimate communion with her sacramental Lord. Sometimes those who entered her room quietly found her in a state of ecstasy, slightly raised above her bed, with a countenance glowing as if reflecting an inner light. One witness described, "She did not seem like a suffering, sick creature, but rather a celestial being momentarily dwelling among us." This Eucharistic miracle became the center of her spiritual life and the main source of strength to bear her daily cross. When asked what the secret of her superhuman patience was, she invariably replied, "It is not my patience, but that of Christ who lives in me since I receive communion." Thus, her sickbed transformed into an altar where she offered herself as a living host alongside the Eucharistic sacrifice, prolonging in her suffering flesh the redemptive offering of Christ. Chapter 6. Counselor of Souls. The fame of Lidwina's sanctity gradually spread far beyond the limits of Schiedam. What began as visits by compassionate neighbors transformed into a constant pilgrimage of people from all walks of life, seeking not only an example of Christian patience, but also spiritual counsel. From her humble sickbed, this uneducated woman in theological matters became a guide for souls thirsty for God. It was astonishing how this young woman, who had spent most of her life secluded in a patient's room, could penetrate so precisely the spiritual problems of those who consulted her. "It is as if she read my soul," remarked a wealthy merchant from Rotterdam after speaking with her. "She spoke of inner struggles I had never dared to confess to anyone." This capacity for spiritual discernment did not derive from human studies, but from the wisdom infused by God into pure and suffering souls. Priests from the region sought her counsel on difficult cases of spiritual direction. The very Bishop of Utrecht, impressed by the depth of her insights, once sent a religious man undergoing a severe vocational crisis to her. After an hour of conversation with Lidwina, the man emerged, transformed. "I have spoken with many doctors of the Church," he later confessed, "but none revealed to me as clearly the will of God for my life as this humble sick woman." Her counsel was not based on elaborate spiritual theories, but on simple, penetrating words that reached the heart of the matter. To a mother anguished by her wayward son's behavior, she would say, "Do not cease to pray, but change your tears of distress into tears of trust. God works in his own time, not ours." 6 months later, that young man experienced a radical conversion and subsequently entered religious life, attributing his transformation to his mother's sincere prayers inspired by Lidwina's guidance. Not everyone who came to her sought only spiritual direction. Some came out of curiosity, others to test her reputation for sanctity. A group of licentious young men from a neighboring town once arrived, pretending to seek counsel, but secretly intending to mock the lame saint, as they ironically called her. Lidwina received them with her customary gentleness. However, Before they could articulate any malicious questions, she spoke to them with such insight into the misdeeds of their dissolute lives and the secret remorse that tormented them that they left deeply moved. Two of them returned days later to make a sincere confession and ask for guidance to change their lives. In the final years of her life, Lidwina was forced to limit the number of visitors due to her extreme physical weakness. Nevertheless, she continued her apostolate of counsel through brief letters dictated to her mother or her confessor. These missives, preserved by their recipients as true spiritual treasures, reveal the extraordinary lucidity of her mind and the maturity of her discernment, even amid intense physical suffering. A fragment of one such letter, addressed to a young widow, summed up the essence of her wisdom. Suffering is like a chisel in the hands of the divine sculptor. Every blow we feel is not meant to destroy us, but to free the image of Christ hidden in our hearts. And chapter 7, the trials of her faith. Contrary to what many might have supposed, Lidwina's life was not without spiritual crises and moments of inner darkness. While God showered her with extraordinary graces, He also allowed her to experience periods of desolation that purified her faith and matured it in true love. These states, which mystics call the dark night of the soul, perhaps constituted the most painful trial of her existence, even more so than her physical torments. The 20th year of her illness marked the beginning of the most severe trial. For nearly 3 years, Lidwina was deprived of every sensible comfort in prayer. The heavenly visions ceased, the ecstasies disappeared, and even the reception of the Eucharist, which once provided ineffable sweetness, became an act of pure faith, devoid of consolation. "I feel as if an impenetrable wall has been erected between God and me," she confided to her confessor. "I pray, but my words seem to bounce off into emptiness. I search for my beloved, but I do not find him." To this spiritual dryness were added intense temptations against faith. The adversary, taking advantage of her weakened state, whispered blasphemous thoughts and sowed doubt about divine goodness. "Where is your God now?" he murmured inwardly. "If he truly loved you, would he allow such abandonment?" Lidwina fought these insinuations by constantly renewing her acts of faith and trust, even though she experienced no consolation in them. "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief," became her constant prayer during this period of trial. A particularly painful aspect of that spiritual night was the misunderstanding of those who had once admired her sanctity. No longer perceiving the external signs of mystical favors, some began to question the authenticity of her previous experiences. Rumors circulated that everything had been feigned, or worse, a demonic deception. These murmurs reached Lidwina's ears, adding the burden of calumny to her many crosses. With admirable equanimity, she never sought to defend herself, trusting that God Himself would vindicate His servant at the proper time. The trial reached its climax when, for several weeks, she was tempted by despair. The thought of suicide, subtly suggested by the enemy, presented itself as a liberation from so much apparently senseless suffering. In that abyss of darkness, Lidwina clung with all her might to the words of Job. "Even if I were to die, in Him I would trust." This heroic fidelity, in the total absence of any comforting presence, perhaps constituted the most eloquent testimony to the authenticity of her love for God, purified of all selfish interest. After this long period of purification, the light gradually returned to her soul. One Easter morning, while receiving communion, she felt the veil tear away and experienced the divine presence with an intensity never before known. It was as if all the previous graces had been but a pale reflection of this new union, she later explained. "I then understood that true intimacy with God does not consist of visions or consolations, but in this naked faith that endures in the darkness." This lesson, learned in the crucible of suffering, turned Lidwina into a consummate teacher of spiritual life, capable of guiding others through their own dark nights. Chapter 8. Her Miracles in Life. Although Lidwina never sought the notoriety of prodigies, God chose to manifest her sanctity through various supernatural phenomena occurring around her. These extraordinary signs, carefully documented by reliable witnesses, were not a source of vanity for Lidwina, nor a cause for pride. Rather, they were occasions of deep humility, as she understood they were the work of the divine and not of her own merit. One of the most frequent miracles was the multiplication of food for the poor. Although she herself subsisted solely on the Eucharist, she always asked her family to set aside part of her meager resources to share with the needy. On one occasion, during a time of great scarcity in the city, her modest pantry, which contained barely a small sack of flour and a few provisions, miraculously fed more than 30 families for several weeks. Witnesses claimed that no matter how much was taken from that sack, it never emptied, recalling the biblical miracle of the widow of Sarepta. Another extraordinary phenomenon was the healing of the sick. Many recovered simply by touching a garment that had been in contact with Lidwina, or by drinking water, blessed with a relic of the cross that she possessed. A particularly moving case was that of a girl born blind, the daughter of a poor widow from Schiedam. Presented before Lidwina, the saint traced the sign of the cross on the child's eyes while praying silently. Instantly, the young girl began to see with perfect clarity, exclaiming in amazement at the colors and shapes she beheld for the first time. She also possessed the gift of knowing distant and future events. During the severe epidemic that ravaged Rotterdam, she predicted with precision which houses would be affected and which would be spared, allowing many to take precautions that saved lives. On another occasion, she revealed to a merchant the betrayal that his partners were planning, thus sparing him from economic ruin. These supernatural insights were never used to arouse admiration, but always for charitable purposes, to prevent harm or console afflictions. Perhaps the most astonishing of all the prodigies was the incorruptibility of her marred body. Despite spending decades confined to the same bed, with open wounds and without the possibility of proper hygiene by today's standards, those who cared for her testified not only that she did not emit any foul odor, but that an inexplicable fragrance, similar to that of fresh flowers, emanated from her person. The physicians who occasionally examined her could find no natural explanation for this phenomenon, especially considering the gravity of her cutaneous injuries. Yet, the greatest miracle was not found in these external signs, but in the inner transformation experienced by those who encountered her. Hardened sinners were converted after a simple conversation with her. Long-standing enmities dissolved when opposing parties jointly visited her, and vocations to religious life flourished among young people who initially came out of curiosity. Her confessor summed up this transformative power in one phrase: "Seeing her suffer with such peace accomplished more for the conversion of souls than 100 sermons." This silent apostolate of example, rather than the spectacular prodigies, constituted for Lidwina the true purpose of her long martyrdom. Chapter 9. Her relationship with the Virgin Mary. Marian devotion held a central place in Lidwina's spirituality. From her childhood, she had learned from her mother to turn to the Blessed Virgin for all her needs. But it was during her illness that this filial relationship reached an extraordinary mystical depth. For her, Mary was not only an intercessor and a model, but also a constant companion in her Calvary. In the early years of her illness, when despair threatened to overwhelm her, Lidwina found particular comfort in meditating on the sorrows of Mary. Contemplating the Mother at the foot of the cross helped her grasp the redemptive meaning of her own suffering. If she, being immaculate, drank even the bitterest chalice, she meditated, with what right should I, a sinner, refuse my small share? This daily meditation gradually molded in her an ever more perfect conformity with the divine will. From the 10th year of her illness onward, she began to receive visits from the Virgin Mary, especially during the vigils of her feasts. These encounters were not mere intellectual visions, but real presences whose effects were indirectly perceived through the transformation in Lidwina. During these visits, her disfigured face shone with supernatural beauty, and her room was filled with a celestial fragrance that lingered for days afterwards. Her confessor, initially skeptical of these phenomena, eventually testified, "It is impossible to doubt the supernatural nature of these manifestations when one observes their effects." The Virgin not only consoled her, but also instructed her on the ways of spiritual perfection. Lidwina carefully recorded these Marian teachings, which were later compiled in a small treatise entitled Conversations with the Mother of Heaven. In these writings, the theological depth expressed in simple words is remarkable, demonstrating that true wisdom comes more from an intimate relationship with God than from academic studies. One of the Marian practices that the Virgin taught her was the contemplation of the Holy Rosary as the privileged way to delve into the mysteries of Christ. Lidwina developed a personal method for reciting it, where each Hail Mary was accompanied by a brief meditation on the corresponding mystery. This form of prayer, which combined vocal simplicity with profound contemplation, quickly spread among the faithful of Schiedam and later throughout the region, contributing significantly to the renewal of popular Marian piety. Lidwina's relationship with Mary transcended mere devotional practice to become a true spiritual communion. On one occasion, she confided to her confessor, "It is not that I think about the Blessed Virgin during the day, it is that I live continuously in her presence, like a child breathing without noticing the air around him." This Marian indwelling manifested in the smallest details. The way she spoke, the sweetness of her gaze, her unchanging patience in the face of adversity, reminding all who approached her of the living presence of the Mother of God. Chapter 10. The Transition to Heaven. As the end of her earthly life approached, Lidwina received from the Lord precise knowledge of the day and hour of her death. 3 months before the foretold date, she shared this news with her confessor and the closest members of her family. "This is not a cause for sorrow, but for joyful hope," she told them serenely, "for I am going to meet the spouse I have longed for all these years of separation." Her final months were a time of intense spiritual preparation. Her physical sufferings reached almost unbearable levels, the final crucible of purification before the definitive encounter. Yet those who accompanied her perceived in her a supernatural joy that stood in dramatic contrast to her bodily state. "It is as if she lives more in heaven than on earth," commented a priest who visited her during those days. "Her words no longer seem of this world, but appear to come from the very gates of eternity." 2 weeks before her departure, she experienced a temporary improvement that baffled the physicians. This respite from her torments allowed her to bid farewell in serenity to all those who had played an important role in her life. To each person, she addressed personal words of comfort and guidance, as if performing one final act of love. To her mother, who could not hold back her tears, she said gently, "Do not lose me, my dear mother. You gain me even more fully. From heaven, I will watch over you far more effectively than from this sickbed." On the eve of her death, she requested to receive all the sacraments of the Church. The parish priest, accompanied by several priests from the region, administered the viaticum and the anointing of the sick in a ceremony both solemn and deeply intimate. Lidwina received these rites with full lucidity and extraordinary fervor. After the celebration, she asked to be left alone for a few hours for her final preparation, a time she devoted to intense contemplative prayer. On April 14, 1433, at dawn, she called her family and her confessor. "The hour has come," she announced in a serene yet weakened voice. She requested that an image of the crucified Christ be placed before her and one of the Virgin Mary at her side. With her gaze fixed on the crucifix, she slowly began reciting Psalm 22, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." When she reached the verse, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Her face lit up with an indescribable expression of joy. Those present attested that at that moment a supernatural light filled the room, and a soft scent of spring flowers permeated the atmosphere. With a sigh of love, Lidwina entrusted her soul to the Creator, thus ending 38 years of continual martyrdom offered for the salvation of souls. Her face, disfigured for so many years by her illness, miraculously appeared restored after death, revealing the youthful beauty she had before the accident, transfigured by a celestial splendor that all recognized as an evident sign of her glorification. Chapter 11. Canonization and Legacy. The news of Lidwina's passing quickly spread throughout the region. An extraordinary multitude gathered to venerate her remains, which were displayed for 3 days without showing any sign of decay, despite the spring heat. Countless faithful testified to healings and special graces obtained by touching her body or invoking her intercession at her mortuary bed. These early miracles were carefully recorded by the parish priest of Schiedam, forming the first foundation for her future canonization process. The burial of Lidwina became an unprecedented event for the small Dutch city. The Bishop of Utrecht personally presided over the funerals, which were attended by numerous priests, religious, and the faithful from across the region. In his homily, the prelate did not hesitate to refer to her as saint, preempting the Church's official judgment. Today we do not simply bury a distinguished daughter of Schiedam. We accompany on her final earthly journey one who already enjoys the beatific vision and whose intercession we invoke from now on. Soon, the signs confirming Lidwina's sanctity multiplied. Her tomb became a pilgrimage site, with many miracles reported, especially healings of ailments considered incurable by the medicine of the time. Barely 5 years after her death, ecclesiastical authorities, impressed by the persistence and authenticity of these prodigies, authorized the first exhumation of her remains, which were found to be incorrupt and emanating a supernatural fragrance perceptible to all. The formal canonization process, begun in 1448, was carried out with the meticulousness characteristic of the Church in such cases. Numerous witnesses were interrogated under oath. The writings about her life and miracles were subjected to rigorous theological scrutiny, and each prodigy attributed to her intercession was verified by nearly scientific criteria. Finally, on March 14, 1890, Pope Leo III solemnly elevated her to sainthood, presenting her as a model of Christian patience and the redemptive offering found in suffering. Saint Lidwina's spiritual legacy transcends the borders of the Netherlands and her own time. Her life stands as an eloquent answer to one of humanity's most anguished questions, the meaning of pain. In an era when the dominant culture strives to avoid suffering at all costs or, when inevitable, regards it as senseless, Lidwina demonstrates that pain, accepted with faith and offered with love, can become an instrument of personal and communal redemption. Her teachings have inspired generations of the sick to find meaning in their afflictions. Hospitals, palliative care centers, and organizations dedicated to the ill have come under her patronage, recognizing in her a model for integrating suffering into a Christian vision of existence. Her intercession is especially invoked by those who endure chronic illnesses or persistent pain, drawing strength from her example to persevere in hope. In art, Saint Lidwina is traditionally depicted on her sickbed, holding a crucifix and with a face transfigured by an expression of supernatural peace. She is often shown surrounded by flowers, alluding to the miraculous fragrance that emanated from her body and the spiritual blossoming her life inspired in many souls. These representations, found in numerous churches across Europe, continue to inspire the faithful to discover that, as the saint taught, it is not suffering that sanctifies us, but the love with which we embrace and offer it. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Lidwina. O glorious Saint Lidwina, you who were purified in the crucible of suffering like gold in the fire and attained the fullness of Christian love, turn your merciful gaze toward us, who still wander through this valley of tears. You who transformed your bed of pain into an altar of constant offering, teach us to discover the redemptive meaning of our daily trials. May we learn from you not to waste a single moment of suffering, however small, but to offer it in union with the passion of Christ for the salvation of souls and the sanctification of the Church. Intercede, O patient Virgin, for all the sick, especially for those who suffer from prolonged or incurable afflictions. Obtain for them the spiritual strength that shone in you, so that their physical sufferings do not overwhelm the hope in their hearts. May they find, as you did in every day of trial, a new opportunity to increase their eternal merits. Pray also for those who care for the sick, that in every patient they may recognize the suffering face of Christ. May your example encourage them to persevere in their noble work, understanding that in serving the weakest, they serve the very Lord who one day will welcome them, saying, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father. I was sick, and you visited me." Grant us, Saint Lidwina, the grace of an authentic Eucharistic devotion. May we, like you, find in the bread of life our primary source of strength to bear our daily crosses. Teach us that in communion with the crucified and risen Christ lies the secret to transforming our suffering into a path of resurrection. And when the hour of our final transition comes, assist us through your powerful intercession. May we, like you, fix our gaze on the crucified Christ, entrusting ourselves completely into the arms of the Heavenly Father. Receive us then into your eternal home, where alongside you and all the saints we shall sing forever the mercies of the Lord. Amen.